Welcome to Lead Smarter, the podcast where you'll hear powerful, no-nonsense conversations about leadership with today's top experts and real-world leaders like yourself. Get the inside strategies, insights, and secrets they've learned on the journey to lead smarter. Let's dive in. Today's guest is Todd Greider, an executive coach and leadership facilitator who helps founders and senior leaders get out of their own way so their teams can actually move. Todd's work sits at the intersection of performance, mindset, and emotional intelligence. He's known for challenging perfectionism, helping leaders ship progress instead of waiting for perfect, and building guardrails so quality stays high without leaders becoming the bottleneck. In this conversation, we talk about why perfectionism is really fear in disguise, how leaders unintentionally slow their teams down, and what executive presence looks like when the pressure is on. Hey, Todd, thank you again for joining us on the podcast on Lead Smarter. I really enjoyed the chance to get to talk to you and get to know you before this call and learn a little bit about your perspective on leadership and basically managing your own perspectives to be a better version of yourself for your team. And one of the things I know that you've brought up in our calls that I thought was really interesting was escaping perfectionism. And what I wanted to ask you on that is you mentioned, like, what does ship at 70% and learn the remaining 30% mean? And what does that look like in practice for a leader and their team?
Yeah, well, David, I appreciate the opportunity and I've enjoyed our conversations. And I think for me, perfectionism, because I'll be the first to admit I escaped it myself. I'm a recovering perfectionist, and so that belief that everything has to be as planned, like no deviations, is something that I hear a lot in the clients that I coach. And that ship at 70% and learn the 30% extra is around just moving forward, doing something. Um, what I've learned throughout my career, I've had great mentors. Perfectionism isn't about getting it right. It's about what happens if I get it wrong. And so perfection is like, am I going to make a mistake? And the reason we hold on to this, I got to get it perfect, is because we're afraid to do something. Fear of judgment, fear of making the wrong decision, and I see it in leaders of all levels. Perfectionism, for me, is avoidance of fear and staying comfortable. And so we use that belief that where you can do everything perfect as a reason to not do something imperfect.
I I wish I didn't resonate with that, and I only say that because I mean here we're in a podcast right now. You know, getting started, putting myself forward. I've been in situations in businesses where I was the operator, and I could be behind the scenes and I could tweak and manage things. Eventually, I became a founder of a business. And I was only comfortable doing that when I had a partner, and I could always say, "Oh, well, I'm not gonna." It's not fully me. But eventually, the business needed me to take a further step forward and be a leader in a space that was more in the spotlight. Super uncomfortable for me,
Mm,
and I was really good, and am still probably very good at finding excuses to not do the thing that forces me to be fully out in the spotlight.
mhm.
I'd much rather be in a supportive role and make it about somebody else. I'm literally having a conversation with you about you. So this is a great example. What can you tell me about your own experiences? I mean, obviously, this sounds like a lesson that not only you might have to tell or work with your own clients, but I'm assuming it's something you've had to learn yourself.
Absolutely. But like I said, I'm a recovering perfectionist, and I want to make
Right.
sure that I got everything right. And I've built a career being in front of audiences, facilitating training, and leading group discussions, coaching people of all levels. Earlier in my career, I always said I'm a perfectionist, and if I can't be the best presenter, I'm not going to do it at all. And it was because I was afraid of putting myself in front of audiences. I'm introverted by nature. I love my quiet space, and so the thought of being in front of an audience, I was like, well, I'm a perfectionist. But really I was
Right.
afraid to put myself out there and to lead a discussion, because what if they didn't agree with me, and someone in the class decided to challenge the trainer or the teacher in the room? How would I respond to that? I mean, am I ready for that? Am I capable of that? And so that perfectionism manifested by all these fears, and I used that as a crutch to keep me from being in front of the classroom and leading those discussions, to being the behind the scenes guy that was building the content, building the curriculum, but never really stepping into something that ultimately I found like a passion for, and being the person that helps to lead the discussion and helping people identify those aha moments. And so my ship at 70% was, okay, I'm going to once a week volunteer myself for something that is completely uncomfortable. I'm going to volunteer to present on a webinar, or I'm going to volunteer to co-facilitate. And then eventually it became, I'm going to volunteer to lead the class myself and facilitate the class until it became second nature. And I didn't even question. I was like, "Hey, you need a facilitator? What topic am I talking about today? And who's the audience? Let's do this." And that came from years and years of just saying, if I just do it, if 80% of the people get something out of it, was I successful? I don't need everyone to walk away with something, because that's never possible. Like, I go into trainings and there's some I get something from and some I don't. So it became like, what am I willing to sacrifice? Well, sacrificing was, I'm not going to appeal to everyone, and that's okay. And that was a hard lesson to learn.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I know that I've heard, the safer you are, the more you appeal to everyone, the less interesting the content, the less, people are not going to be paying attention if it's been sanitized entirely. And why would they? There's nothing to learn. It's developed for no one. What you've described kind of reminds me of a quote I heard from Alex Ramosi. He said one of his favorite things he had heard about fear was that it's a mile wide and an inch deep.
Mhm.
Like, it's terrifying when you're looking at it, but then once you step in it, it's not nothing really to be afraid of. You barely dip in and then you're on the other side of it.
And if you step in it enough, it no longer becomes a fear. It becomes just part of who you are.
Yeah, and I was also gonna ask you, if you're gonna just have a ship it mentality, see swinging all the way on the opposite side of it, and maybe the guardrails are too loose and good enough becomes something that lowers standards. How do you avoid, you know, swinging the pendulum too far?
Yeah, so certainly, getting that perfectionism and moving away from that and being willing to accept that 80% and then that 20 or 30% learning. Um, if not done properly, you can certainly diminish the quality of our work. And I've had clients that are in the software engineering and launching new software, new applications, and there's this commonly a belief like this has to go well. Like, we have to, it has to be 100% functional, no hiccups. We got to launch it, but everything
Right.
has to work perfectly. And the reality is, you launch something, something's going to go break, something's going to go wrong. And the key is, do you have clear guardrails in place? And what I mean by that is, some people will say, well, we have to make sure it's good enough. My question
Right.
to my client was, how do you define good enough? Because what's good enough for me might be different than good enough for you, David. What is the definition of good enough? And then when you have that definition, how do you preserve the non-negotiables? The things like clarity and accuracy. If it's accurate and clear, but perhaps one of the features doesn't work
Right.
when you launch it, something goes wrong, there's a glitch, and it doesn't work. Is that okay? And what are you willing to allow to not be imperfect, but still go live, knowing that it can be imperfect and not reduce the value or quality that the audience will gain from whatever it is you're launching. In this case, like, if 100% of the applications didn't work, but 90 or 80 or 90% of them did, is that still a win? Because majority of your audience got something from it. They saw the value of it, even in an imperfect state.
I feel like in a leader's perspective, like, they're kind of like the last guardrail, right? Like, they're the last
Mhm.
check before things are released. It's almost like that the stakes are obviously clearly higher than for the rest of your team. I guess how do you help leaders who that's their experience? They're the final filter, not put them in a position where they're also the bottleneck. Like, they can be the point at which they don't actually allow the release. So is it like agreements that they make with their team so that they don't allow themselves to prevent the release due to the fear of the stakes being that high?
Yeah, so I think the question then becomes to the leader is, when you're about ready to make that decision, that judgment of it's ready to go live or not, is it based on fear or fact? If it's fear because you're concerned that it's not going to be perfect, or is it the fact that perhaps the audience isn't ready for it, or maybe there's some other variable like the organizational culture needs to shift, and there's certain checks and balances that need to go into place before this can
Right,
be fully functional. If you launch a system, but maybe the technical abilities or the infrastructure isn't quite there, so this is going to push the envelope, but
right,
the mindset of the people to use this new tool might not be there. So you have to have like your heart and mind into not just the tool, but the willingness to use the tool in the way that it was designed and intended. That's a clear fact. But
right.
again, what it comes down to is, do you have the right audience to test it? Test the theory, get that grassroots moving and say, if we can get 10% of the people to use it, that 10% can get 20 or 30% over the next 3 to 6 months because some people are trailblazers and some aren't. So you
Right.
start to unpack what is really the holding back a decision. Is it fear or fact? And if it comes down to fear, the key is, what do you need to do in order to move past that? And is, are your guardrails in place? Do you have a clear definition of good? What are you willing to
Right.
accept as imperfect but still deliver value? And is that an acceptable risk or margin for you to make an informed decision to move forward? And if the answer is yes, then what's the right decision to move from this point forward?
I actually have several clients who are very particular, like, I don't wanna call it, like, micromanaging, but so particular about quality and maybe specifics of language that I've actually watched them get in their own way from releasing, and creating this buildup and then putting that on the team. I love the idea of building these guardrails and identifying, like, quality checks to identify that the value of releasing is clearly higher than getting all punctuation accurate, and in the situation that it's still editable, like, it's released, you
Mm,
can go edit it, don't prevent release for a value that isn't worth the delay or isn't worth the opportunity cost of having
mm.
actually released to the market. Um, I wanted to also talk to you about something that you had talked about with me, is rewiring the leadership mind, and as it relates to the safety bias, how do you explain the brain's safety bias to clients so they see why staying stuck can feel easier than changing?
Yeah. So I think it goes back to studies years ago of just of human nature. Our brains are wired to keep us safe. And
Right.
prehistoric times, it was like, your life might be in jeopardy if you're out. But today, like the reality is most of the things that we interact with in life are not life threatening. And so what are we really keeping ourselves safe from? Well, it's safe from our own self judgment of, am I worthy enough or do enough, or am I presenting enough value, or what will other people think? And so this safety bias keeps us, this need to keep us safe or keep us in our comfortable zone, also keeps us from being more productive, more efficient, speaking more clearly and directly because we don't want to offend somebody, or we don't want to say the wrong thing and have it misinterpreted in a way that makes us look bad. And so it really is that internal mechanism, those voices in our head that keep us safe, even though there's really nothing to be scared of other than the risk that we put ourselves in any given situation.
I'm interested in your thoughts on how, obviously, what you're doing is you're coaching a leader to
Mm,
in this space to try to get out of their own way to be able to release things based on a level of comfort and a level of value so that they're not stopping the business from moving forward. Obviously, the leaders in that business, they also are leading teams who are looking to them on for signals to how to
mm,
operate inside this org, which means their ability to say, "Hey, this is good enough. We do accept that there are risks." That basically, if I understand correctly, you're saying it doesn't have to be perfect means that it's also okay to make mistakes, which could translate directly to your team, who's either going to be sharing and moving things forward as effectively as possible, or they're going to be hiding mistakes from you. Can you speak to how that translates, not just the work you're doing with the leader, but how that can be a role model for your organization and what that impact means?
yeah. Well, and I think you said it clearly, which is setting that expectation. Well, yes, mistakes are acceptable, but it goes back to like calculated risk. Often when leaders
Right.
are communicating, they'll communicate a decision, but they don't necessarily always communicate the why behind the decision or the context that they took into play in order to make the informed decision. Their team may just hear the outcome, but they don't understand the decision process or the rubric that that leader used to say, here's how I make informed decisions. So in an example, like if you're communicating change to an organization, you might say, well, there's some organizational shifts. Here's the decision that was made, and here's how it impacts you.
Right.
Okay, but the recipient of that doesn't has no idea what went into play. Like, did they think about my well being or how I might be perceived by me if I were to report to someone else or do this work? And so the context is not there. So only the decision is what's communicated. And so people start to create their own story and assumptions. And those stories may or may not be correct. And so, from a leader's perspective, the more clear you can get and the more you can help your teams understand not just the decisions that are made, but why they were made and how they were made, then people have more confidence and trust in your decisions, whether they like them or not.
Are you are you able to share some tools that you might offer to your own clients to be able to not only navigate this for themselves, but also help their teams navigate this kind of uh, response to perfectionism and trying to enable the whole organization to be more fluid and more action oriented? Is there any tools that you might offer your own clients or their teams?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost is just understanding that people make decisions based on emotion, not logics. You can you can give a anybody can give a guidance or insight based on logic, but we're all human. We act on emotion, and most conversations inside of organizations focus on logic because
Right.
talking about emotions with team is scary because it brings up all these other things that some leaders may be equipped to handle and some may not, because emotional intelligence is something that we're used to just quick decisions, reactive environments, and then we move on because that's what makes sense. But how we process those actions, I think, is different. And so when I talk with leaders, is helping them understand, okay, that's your decision. Now, why did you make that decision? What did you take into consideration about how the audience you want the audience to feel versus how you anticipate they may feel? So when we talked about earlier about calculated risk, do you have you thought through all the different layers of what each decision truly means, not just to you or the organization, but to the person who's ultimately going to hear that, and they're either going to process it the way you had anticipated, or they're going to come up with their own story about what happened. And there's either going to be alignment or there's going to be a disconnect, and helping people slow down a bit and break down the why, not just the what, and then the how it was made, and having a clear story to tell your team about each of those components so that they not only see the logic but they understand that you thought about the emotional side and what it really meant to them as well beyond just the decision itself.
I think what you just described, you may have answered the question I was thinking about. I wanted to ask you just now, but one of the things I was trying to figure out from your perspective as you're coaching, what are some signals that you use to help diagnose what each person needs? Because you've just described what I think maybe you have the leader do and try to help them sort through emotional intelligence, asking the right questions. Is there anything in particular that you use in when you're coaching um, and trying to identify direction and autonomy without treating everybody the same, just running through the same questions? How do you navigate and personalize helping somebody diagnose what they need?
Yeah. Well, as a coach, we certainly don't want to diagnose. We're not in the business of diagnosing people or
Sure.
passing judgment, but rather asking questions. And there are certain things that you can listen to, word choices that are more fact and logic based versus emotional driven. And also, are they getting to really understand the other audience? And what I mean by that is typically when people communicate something, their check and balance at the end of the conversation is, what questions do you have? Well,
Right.
most people don't answer that question because they're still processing whatever was just shared with them. But if you pause for a moment and say, how does what I just shared make you feel? Or what impact are you taking away with what I just shared? Now you're asking them to process it in real time and give a thoughtful response to something you said about how they feel, not just what they heard. And that's a key distinction between just checking the box, asking for feedback versus really asking a thought provoking question that's going to drive a conversation.
It's interesting because I'm literally doing one on ones with my own team members and we'll talk about whatever their needs are. And that's what I try to do is I try to be there to help navigate decisions and be a resource for them. But at the end, I still do what you said. And I've always thought of myself as somebody that's relatively emotionally intelligent. But I admit I've never ended with a one-on-one in a business setting. How does that make you feel? Like, I usually am asking, like,
Mhm,
"Is there anything else I can help with? Do you have any other questions?" Sometimes they answer, but it's hard for me to imagine now because I haven't set that tone,
mhm,
how my own team would respond to me changing it up and asking them how it makes them feel. They think of me as a touchy-feely guy, so I think they'd be
mhm,
like, "This is weird, but okay."
mhm.
but I don't know if they're going to be comfortable answering a question that's really targeting their emotions.
And again, it may not be the case, but it also changes people's perception of you, whether they're comfortable
Right.
answering that question or not. It puts forth the perception, whether it's inherent or not, that you care not just about that the decision was made and that you had the conversation, but how are they processing it? And depending on the quality of your relationship with that
Right.
person, they may be very forthright or just their own personality. If they wear their heart on a sleeve, they're going to tell you exactly how they feel. Others may be more reserved, but the question is, how do you want to be remembered? Somebody that at least asked how they feel versus what questions do you have? And we had the conversation. I can check the box and we're done with it.
Yeah.
Um, whether it's answered or not, there's still relationship value or relationship capital that's gained on both sides by at least acknowledging that this is going to evoke an emotional response, whether you choose to share it with me or not.
That's awesome. It's so for me, it's like, wow, that's so basic. I can't believe I didn't think about it. And I do love it as because it's the kind of question I would almost like reserve for a relationship
Hmm.
versus and I mean, it still is a relationship. I just don't it's easy to dehumanize it and say we're here about the work and the logic.
Hmm. Yeah.
So I love that approach and I'm definitely gonna steal it. So thanks for sharing it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I also wanted to talk about from individual contributor standpoint. What would you say are some of the most predictable traps for founders, like doctors and or in small businesses, when they first start leading teams? Like people that are not going to come from the perspective of managing groups of people yet, and they're having to learn that for the first time.
Yeah. I would say I would call it task hoarding, not being able to delegate things that, yes, you as a founder do well, but training someone else or onboarding someone else to do that task, most likely you will always be able to do it faster than they will. But you also never gain that capacity as a founder if you never relinquish the control of that task. So there has to be this period where you're willing to put in the extra effort and allow that person to trip and fall and learn as you did when you were building that skill or competency and be able to move forward again. I think it goes back to our ship at 80, 70%, which is,
Mhm.
what are the guardrails that I'm willing to allow this person to work within to try something, knowing that their output may not be perfect, but as long as the accuracy is there and the clarity and the what good looks like quality is checked, can it still move forward in its imperfect state and know that there might be some cleanup at the end? And the answer, in most cases, the answer is yes. It's just, are you willing to relinquish that and say, yes, I could do it faster and maybe I can do it better. Should I still be doing it at all?
Right. I'm commonly heard saying that I don't expect somebody who's working for me just getting started, specifically if they're just getting started. But even if like somebody comes on board on my team at any point in time at all, I'll always be both the founder and like 10 years ahead of them. So they're never going to catch up on tasks that are just coming from me. So my expectation should never be that they're going to do 100% unless I'm hiring them that's something that's specialized that's outside of my skill set and they're going to do better than me probably. And that's why I
Hmm.
hired them.
Yeah.
But I do love the idea of just identifying, like and I love the idea of task hoarding. It's a term I've not heard before, in these conversations, and I'm definitely gonna be using that as well because that is definitely an experience that I've had with clients that are struggling for the first time to even know how to delegate.
Hmm.
Um, also wanted to talk to you about, executive presence. What does executive presence really mean in the day-to-day behavior, and how do you help leaders get concise?
Yeah. And I think when most people think about executive presence, they're thinking like polish and presentation skills and
Right.
how they dress, how they show up. And for some, it may even be like, what kind of, how much charisma do they have? Do they light up a room? Do they captivate an audience? But there's plenty of stories where you have leaders that are not charismatic, that have executive presence and they're not the spotlight of the room. And I think shifting our perspective to say like, executive presence, yes, it can be all of those things, but executive presence is also the ability to communicate clarity under pressure. How calm can they stay when the house is on fire and things are going wrong? Are they poised or are they reactive? And executives that are polished and have great presence, they're able to maintain composure and make calculated and informed decisions, even when everything is a disaster or everything's a mess, because they've maybe been there before, or they don't allow the things that they can't control to define how they make a decision and move forward. So, yes, it can be presentation and communication, but it's ultimately how do you manage your own emotions and that distinct nature to be reactive and just start solving all the problems versus how do we think through this clearly and make a informed decision so we don't stay in this mess.
I have team members that I've tried to develop into leaders myself because I see the what they do in their job, they're excellent at. And then as I see them grow, I see them continuously be excellent. Um, and so in my as I'm watching them, I'm thinking about where I would love for them to go in their organization and in their career path. Obviously, it's their career path.
Hmm.
I shouldn't be the one telling them where to go. But when I talk to them, I reach out to them. I'm like, "Hey, I think you're doing a great job here. I think you could do X." Uh, I've had leaders in my own organization tell me like what you just said, like being able how they handle pressure when the house is on fire. That's
Hmm.
exactly where they don't want to be. Like, yes, I'm happy to do this. I'm happy to crush it, but I want to be able to check out at the end of the day
Hmm.
and having to have the context of the whole business, even though I see how they're doing things and I think they have that capacity. I think there's a difference, obviously, between capacity and interest. And while I think I can handle that as an executive, and I think I see that ability in others, it's important to me to recognize not everybody wants to do that. Even if they
Hmm.
can, they don't want to. So I like that you've identified that and distilled it down to something that I could share to somebody and you say, "Yep, that sounds like a pretty good skill, but I don't wanna do that."
Yeah. Well, and building off what you said, I like how you said like the capacity and interest, but I think there's another layer too, which is interest and motivation. Those are not mutually exclusive. You could be very
Right.
interested in something and not have the motivation to do it because maybe you're working 90 hours a week and
Yep.
you just can't see enough motivation to give up more capacity to do more things on top of what you already have stacked up. So it's like you almost need all three of those to figure out and have clarity and the capacity and focusing on what I'm interested on and the motivation to do it all, even when things aren't necessarily going optimal and going our way.
Yeah, and if I mean, I feel like for me, one of the most important things I can do is at first in my business, it was to be able to identify and be able to manage and help to delegate.
Mm.
Later, as the business started to get bigger, it was how can I not just delegate, but to help develop leaders in my business so that I'm literally delegating leadership and
Mhm.
growth so that I can step further in front of the business. And I feel like I'm still just early in learning what that's like. Admittedly, like I can coach other people and it's easier to look at somebody else's problems. But when the killer's in the house, it's harder. It's harder for me to navigate that. But anyways, I don't know if that's your experience too. Like obviously, it's easier sometimes to see somebody else's problems from the
Mm.
outside than it is to see and manage our own, but that's what it's like for me.
Yeah, oh, absolutely, and you're not in that alone. Even the best coaches out there also are a work in progress. They understand the importance of like they're learning and growing, and they may see something in themselves as they're coaching someone else and saying, "Oh, okay, I do that. I do that as well," and that's an area that I need to work on. And I see my behaviors in those that I coach, and vice versa. So you're learning and coaching at the same time, not just the person in front of you, but you're looking in the mirror and saying okay, where do I need to continue to learn and grow? And what am I avoiding? What am I hiding behind as far as fears or limiting beliefs or insecurities? Because we all have them.
Right. And that's a perfect segue actually, because one of the things I wanted to ask you as we started to wrap up this episode, I know that you already provide coaching and guidance and even leadership to people that look to you for advice. But if you had the ability to just travel back in time and you only had 60 seconds and you could give yourself one piece of advice, just you, what would
Mhm.
that piece of advice be?
Start before you're ready because I've throughout my career I've let so many fears hold me back and insecurities as far as like my self-worth and putting my self-worth in other people's perception of me and learning that over the last 20 something years of my career has been eye-opening. So start before you're ready because you'll never be as ready as you think you want to be.
That's great advice. I still I still do not do that. I did that with this podcast. I started before I was ready, surrounded myself from people, and then I started having conversations. But that was the only instance that I had done that. Everything else, I had been working behind somebody else and letting them take the lead. And doing it for yourself is scary. I love that advice though, because it is. If I hadn't started before I was ready, I would never have started.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I think that's great advice. And I'm also curious before we step away, what is some books that you're reading right now that you think would be useful for listeners to get more educated about themselves, to develop their own leadership?
Yep. So I would say some of the books that have always resonated with me, and I've read them a couple times, would be James Clear, Atomic Habits. For me, that's the perfectionist buster. Just getting started doing something consistently over and over again. If you want to create a new habit, new behavior, that's my go-to. As far as communication and speaking clearly, I love the book. I believe it's by Chip and Dan Heath called "Made to Stick." So, how do you make things resonate with the people that are in front of you? Most times when we communicate for ourselves and how we're comfortable, but how do people need to hear things from us? And how do we package it in a way that sticks in their minds?
Right.
And I love it because it just has duct tape on the cover. It's like made to stick, which is
Nice.
perfect to how to shape your thoughts and your mindset to get your message across to the people that matter and to help them with whatever it is that you're offering.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Todd. Thank you for all of your time today, for the insights that you shared, also for the resources that you just gave us some options for. I really appreciate it. Looking forward to chatting with you more soon, but thank you for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity, David.
Hey, thanks for listening to this episode of Lead Smarter. And thank you to the partners and sponsors who believe in our mission to evolve ourselves to elevate others. Speaking of elevating others, if you liked this episode, please be sure to like, follow, subscribe, and share. It would mean a lot to me and the team that works so hard behind the scenes so we can all learn together. And of course, thank you to the expert guests who kindly join us as generous guides on our journey to lead smarter.